George Michelson first saw the basin of Hesper Vale from the Western Survey Rail just before local dusk, when the sky was doing what new arrivals always mistook for weather and old residents knew was orbital geometry. The great primary above the colony was not a planet in the usual human sense. It was a superterrestrial world, red with iron oxides and broad dust seas, hanging so large in the sky that the mind rejected it. Beyond it, or rather across the vault that seemed to flow around it, green sheets of ionized light burned where the system's magnetic fields tangled with the star wind. There were smaller moons, a slow white point of a transport platform in synchronous orbit, and a comet tail scored thin across the dark like a scratch in varnish. The new people stared upward at all of it. The older ones looked at the valley floor, the roads, the power towers, the dome seals, the snowmelt channels, and the distant glow of habitation windows. Beauty was not ignored here. It was simply not trusted. George sat alone on the left side of the rail car, one hand on the case that held his field tablets and pressure tools. He was 52, broad-shouldered without being large, and had the careful stillness of a man who had spent enough years around machinery to distrust dramatic movement. He had come to Hesper Vale on a 6-year systems contract with Colonial Works Authority, though contracts had a way of becoming lives on frontier worlds. Across the aisle, a group of technicians from the last incoming shuttle were speaking in low voices, still full of the brittle energy of transit and orientation lectures. Beyond them, a child pressed both palms to the glass and said, not quietly enough, "It looks like the end of the universe." Her mother smiled without amusement. "It looks expensive," she said. George turned slightly at that and almost laughed. She was right. The colony occupied the floor of a long glacial basin, one of the few regions on the planet where temperature swing, substrate stability, water access, and radiation shielding could be balanced without ridiculous expenditure. That still left ordinary expenditure, which on a world 43 light-years from Earth was another way of saying an amount so large it vanished into abstraction. The main habitation complex lay in linked domes along the valley's flatter eastern section, each dome geodesic only in outward appearance. Their real structure was layered, pressure membrane inside, composite tension lattice, micrometeor shield, thermal foam, dust-shedding skin, and a web of external maintenance tracks. Between them rose a needle-like central tower that served 3 purposes at once: communications, atmospheric exchange control, and symbolic reassurance. People liked towers, George had observed. If a settlement wished to believe in itself, it built something vertical. He had read the colony briefs aboard ship, and then again in the descent dormitory, and once more while waiting for customs and bioscreen. Hesper Vale had been founded 27 local years earlier as a joint scientific-industrial settlement. The original charter had been simple enough to fit on one page: secure a durable human foothold in the Thalassa system, investigate the planet's climatology, biology, and mineral chemistry, develop exportable intellectual property faster than import costs accumulated, remain politically stable. Like all simple charters, it concealed a multitude of arrangements. No colony began as a free society. It began as a supply equation: air, water, calories, shelter mass, radiation exposure, energy return, medical redundancy, and labor specialization had to be solved before anyone could afford philosophy. On Hesper Vale, that early arithmetic had hardened into institutions. There was a civic board elected by residents, yes, but voting rights were weighted by residency class and service contribution until one completed full settlement tenure. There were cooperatives, but they operated under infrastructure quotas set by engineers and logistics planners. There was private enterprise, but only above the life support line, as the colonists called it. No one privately owned oxygen, ice wells, external shield foam, reactor maintenance rights, or the rail grid. Frontier rhetoric had eventually yielded to thermodynamics. George approved of that more than he would have admitted at orientation. The rail car curved down and slowed as it approached the station platform. He could see the outer workyards now, crawler cranes crouched under floodlights, cargo pallets in sealed rows, rover bays sunk into bermid shelters, and long silver tanks half buried to buffer temperature fluctuations. Beyond them stood the old thermal plant, now mostly auxiliary reserve, and farther up the slope the newer fusion stacks in their armored housings. Even at this distance he could make out repair scaffolds on Stack 3. That, almost certainly, was why he had been brought. A voice came over the cabin speaker, clipped and human rather than synthetic. Arrival at Hesper Central West. Residents transferring to internal transit. Remain seated until pressure corridor is confirmed. Visiting contractors, survey staff, and technical personnel report to intake corridor B. Welcome to Hesper Vale. Welcome, George thought, was a sentimental word for a place that had spent 3 decades learning how not to die. He rose with the others when the car unlocked. The woman with the child gave him a polite nod. He nodded back, lifted his case, and joined the slow file through the pressure lock. The colony smelled faintly of resin, warm metal, and cooked starch. That was not disappointing. Every functioning human settlement smelled, at bottom, like systems working hard. Inside intake corridor B, a line had formed beneath a wall display showing district maps, maintenance notices, and a power use advisory in amber letters. Stack 3, output curtailed 11%. Non-essential industrial loads remain phase limited until further notice. George paused to read it. Then he read the smaller text beneath. Cause: injector asymmetry under thermal drift. Temporary compensation active. Engineering crews assigned. He smiled despite himself. The universe, however large, was always local when something warped under heat. George Michelson. The voice came from behind him. He turned. Brenda Clark was taller than he had expected from her file, raw-boned, square-faced, and wearing the dark utility jacket of Colonial Works, with the insignia half peeled at one shoulder. Her hair had been cut for convenience, not effect. She held a slate in one hand and looked at him with quick appraisal, the way engineers and shipmasters and certain doctors did, measuring capacity before courtesy. That's me. I'm Brenda Clark. Systems Integration, Valley Infrastructure. I'm supposed to collect you before personnel loses you for 4 hours. She glanced at the advisory screen. You've already found our little embarrassment, I see. Only 11% embarrassed. Today. She extended her hand. Her grip was dry and direct. We were hoping for someone older. George raised an eyebrow. Meaning experienced, she said. I was trying to be diplomatic. In that case, I'm delighted to disappoint you less. That produced a brief, involuntary smile. Come on, we've got one more stop before housing. They moved through a service corridor instead of the public atrium. Through occasional view panels, George caught fragments of colony life. A school group moving in pairs beneath a mural of the first landing. hydroponic workers unloading nutrient drums, two off-shift welders arguing over sports metrics from an orbital relay feed, a market gallery with fabric banners and a line outside a bread counter. The place was more populous than the report images had suggested. Not crowded, but dense with use. Hesper Vale had crossed the invisible line between outpost and town. That mattered. It meant habits had formed. Habits became norms, and norms became a politics stronger than law. "You said one more stop," George said. "Administrative necessity. Carol wants to meet you before I take you to Stack 3. "Carol Rourke?" "Director of Civic Operations, yes." George looked at her. "Civic Operations is receiving engineering contractors personally?" Brenda gave a short breath that might have been amusement. "On Hesper, Civic includes anything that keeps 5,000 people breathing and prevents the other 12,000 dependents in the surrounding service districts from complaining. Carol likes to know where fragility lives. Right now, fragility lives in power generation." That was a fair answer, and not comforting. They passed through a compact security scan and entered a quieter sector of the central tower. Here the floors were softer underfoot, the lighting warmer, the walls less visibly functional. George always disliked these transitional spaces in frontier settlements, the places where necessity dressed itself as administration. They suggested not corruption exactly, but aspiration. A colony began with shelter tubes and machine shops. Once it started paneled conference rooms, it had either become civilized or dangerous. Carol Rourke's office was neither grand nor decorative. It had one wall screen alive with system maps, another filled with pinned paper notes. Actual paper, rare enough to signal either eccentricity or discipline, and a window that looked out across the domes toward the darkening basin. She stood as they entered. She was younger than Brenda, perhaps by a decade, but carried authority with less visible effort. Her hair was dark, her posture formal without stiffness, and her expression one of practiced listening. George had met administrators who looked like rulers, and others who looked like clerks. Carol Rourke looked like a woman accustomed to deciding between unpleasant options before breakfast. "Mr. Michelson, thank you for coming on short notice." He shook her hand. The contract didn't suggest it was optional. "No," she said, "it didn't." Brenda leaned against the wall by the door, arms folded. Carol gestured to a chair, and George sat. She remained standing for a moment, then seemed to decide that ceremony was a waste of power, and took the seat opposite him. "I'll be plain," she said. "Stack 3 is not in crisis. If it were, we'd be speaking in a corridor while people ran behind us. But it is in a condition I dislike. Our margin is narrowed, and this colony is built on margins. Winter draw is coming. The northern agri-domes are already contesting allocation limits. Orbital wants us to resume deuterium cracking at full capacity within 2 quarters. Research keeps asking for stable high-load windows for deep substrate scans. Every department believes its work is indispensable, which means my office exists to rank indispensability without producing mutiny." George nodded. "And you think the problem is deeper than injector drift?" "I think any persistent technical fault in a colony this mature is partly technical and partly social." That answer interested him more than he expected. Carol touched the wall screen, and a schematic of the power grid expanded between them. The valley has 4 primary fusion stacks, 1 legacy thermal plant, distributed solar where feasible, and storage in salt blocks and superconducting banks. On paper, the redundancy is adequate. In practice, Stack 1 is overdue for liner replacement. Stack 2 is carrying too much load because nobody wants to shut it down long enough for major inspection. Stack 3 is drifting, and Stack 4 is supporting expansion districts that were approved during a year of optimistic projections and cheap imports. Our engineering reports are competent. What I need from you is competence, without local loyalty. Brenda spoke from the wall, meaning none of us can tell anymore which compromises are normal and which are stupid. George looked from one woman to the other. How long has 3 been unstable? Brenda answered. 7 weeks detectable, 3 weeks undeniable. We compensated twice. The second compensation held worse than the first. Any signs of chamber wear beyond model? Some. Not enough to explain the pattern. Fuel purity issue? Checked. Sensor drift? Checked. Structural creep in injector ring? Within tolerance, Brenda said, then added, unless tolerance is lying. George leaned back slightly. And you want me to tell you whether the machine is failing, the model is wrong, or the organization is flattering itself? Carol's expression did not change. Yes. There was a silence. Outside the window, the basin darkened into layers of violet and black, and the first night guide lights traced lines along the roads between domes. George could see service vehicles moving like insects toward the power district. At last, he said, then I'll need access to everything. Logs, maintenance deferrals, procurement substitutions, personnel rotations, local fabrication records, not just the polished reports. You'll have it, Carol said. Brenda gave him a more skeptical look. Most of it. Carol ignored that. George stood. Then, I'd better start before the colony has time to explain itself to me. That brought the faintest hint of approval to Carol Rourke's face. Mr. Michelson, she said, you'll find that Hesper Vale is a reasonable place, so long as no one asks too much of it. He picked up his case. In my experience, Director, that's another way of saying everyone already is. Brenda pushed off from the wall. Come on, I'll take you to the stack. They left the tower by a lower service exit into the open transit tube. Night had come fully to the basin, and with it the colony's true shape. The domes shone from within like half-buried stars. The central tower burned in vertical bands. Along the valley floor ran the white threads of guideways and power conduits, every line deliberate, every junction earned. Above it all, the red primary filled half the sky, immense and patient, while green auroral curtains moved like silent combustion over the thin upper atmosphere. For a moment, George stopped walking. Brenda glanced at him. First good look? Yes. Most people say something profound. He considered. Those dome footings on the east row, he said, pointing. They're settling unevenly. She stared, then laughed outright for the first time. You may do. They boarded a utility crawler headed north. It ran low and fast over the service road, passing water reclamation towers, ice melt reservoirs sealed under transparent covers, and the long agricultural domes where light spectra shifted in horizontal bands, blue for leaf mass, red for flowering, amber for maintenance. Human life under constraint always became visible in wavelengths and timetables. George found that oddly reassuring. Tell me about the colony, he said as they rode. Brenda sat across from him, elbows on knees. You mean officially or actually? Actually? She nodded toward the lit valley behind them. Officially, Hesper is a charter settlement with mixed governance, civic franchise, labor representation, and open advancement for all tenure classes. Actually, it's a machine for keeping specialists where they're needed without making them feel trapped. First-generation founders got voting priority, resource shares, and naming rights. Second-generation residents inherited prestige, but not enough spare capacity to act like aristocrats. Contract workers come in tiers. Short-term technicals like you have mobility but no say. Long-tenure settlers can buy into district cooperatives after service thresholds. Everybody complains the board has too much power, and everybody demands the board solve problems that no private group could solve, which means the current arrangement survives. Stable? Stable enough, unequal enough to irritate people, rational enough to defend itself. And you? She looked out into the dark. Born here, which means I'm licensed to complain and economically unable to leave. George nodded. That, too, was frontier honesty. The crawler crested a ridge, and Stack 3 came into view. The fusion complex stood apart from the habitation line, surrounded by blast berms and maintenance gantries, its containment housings low and broad rather than dramatic. No sane engineer built romance into a power plant. White work lights shone across the service platforms. A plume of harmless excess heat shimmered upward from the rejection towers. On the main access frame, 3 suited workers moved in deliberate sequence around an injector manifold. "Looks calm," George said. Brenda's voice grew flatter. That's the problem. Things are calm right up until a colony starts eating its reserves. The crawler slowed at the security gate. George looked through the windshield at the lit geometry of the plant, at the workers ant small against the machinery, at the cables and tanks and service arms. Here was the real center of Hesper Vale. Not the tower, not the board chamber, not the market, not the schools. Civilization was always eager to explain itself in terms of ideals. But out on new worlds, its heart still beat inside pumps, valves, reactors, and the willingness of tired people to maintain them correctly. He felt, not fear exactly, but that old pressure behind the ribs that came when a difficult system was about to reveal whether it had merely broken or had been misunderstood from the beginning. Brenda unsealed her harness and stood. "Welcome to the actual colony, George Michelson." He looked once more at the glowing valley, then at the stack. "Good," he said. "That's the one I came for." And together they stepped out into the engineered night. From the ridge above the power district, Hesper Vale looked less like a frontier settlement and more like a deliberate machine. George Michelson stood beside the crawler where Brenda had parked it, studying the valley under full night illumination. The domes glowed like submerged moons, soft pink and amber from interior agricultural lighting. Between them stretched the precise lattice of transport lines, maintenance corridors, water conduits, and power trunks. The central tower rose in the distance, its signal arrays blinking in measured sequence, linking the colony to orbital platforms circling high above. Farther out, where the basin widened, new construction towers had appeared since the colony schematics George had studied on the ship. Expansion. He frowned slightly. "You see the same thing I do," Brenda said beside him. "That depends. I see at least 4 districts under development that don't exist in your infrastructure report." 5, she corrected. 2 residential, 2 industrial, 1 research cluster. George glanced at her. "While your power margin is collapsing." "Correct." He nodded slowly. "Optimism is a universal resource." Brenda laughed quietly. You're going to like it here." They resumed walking toward the main Stack 3 service entrance. Up close, the fusion plant had none of the distant elegance it possessed from the valley floor. Pipes ran everywhere in layered redundancy. Heat exchangers rose in ribbed towers like metallic skeletons. Access scaffolds surrounded the containment housings, where engineers moved with practiced efficiency. The fusion stacks themselves were mostly hidden inside armored shells, thick composite rings designed to contain pressure, radiation, and the occasional human mistake. A colony could tolerate almost any problem except the loss of reliable energy. The security gate scanned their badges and admitted them into the primary service corridor. Inside, the air smelled faintly metallic and warm, the scent of machinery doing continuous work. George liked that smell. It was the smell of controlled violence, hydrogen nuclei colliding at temperatures that no natural environment on this planet would ever produce. Brenda led him along a narrow passage overlooking the injector systems. "Stack 3 is a standard toroidal confinement unit," she said. "Second-generation colonial design, magnetic containment ring, plasma temperature around 100 million Kelvin, deuterium-tritium cycle." "I know the model." "Then you know why we're nervous." George nodded. A DT reactor was efficient, but it required precise injection symmetry. Any deviation in the injector ring could distort plasma flow, forcing the magnetic containment system to compensate. Do that long enough, and the entire reactor developed subtle stresses that the original models rarely predicted. They stopped at a viewing platform overlooking the injector manifold. 3 technicians in radiation suits were finishing a calibration sweep around the outer housing. George leaned on the rail and watched. He said nothing for nearly 2 minutes. Brenda waited. "What are you seeing?" she finally asked. "Not enough chaos." She raised an eyebrow. "Machines usually break loudly," George continued. "Vibration, heat spikes, structural drift. This one's behaving too politely." "You're saying the readings are lying?" "I'm saying the system thinks it's stable." "And it isn't?" George tapped the railing thoughtfully. "That's what we're going to find out." 2 hours later, they were sitting in the control room overlooking the containment ring. Holographic displays floated above the main console. Plasma flow maps, injector symmetry graphs, magnetic containment stability fields. George had been silent through most of the diagnostics. Brenda had watched his process with growing interest. "You don't start where most engineers start," she said finally. "Most engineers start where the problem appears." "And you don't." "I start where the problem became acceptable." That made her pause. Before she could respond, the control room door opened. Carol Rourke stepped inside. Even here, in the engineering sector, people straightened slightly when she entered. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. Carol approached the console. "Status?" Brenda answered. "Still investigating injector asymmetry. No catastrophic drift yet." Carol looked at George. "And your assessment?" George gestured to the display showing the power distribution grid. "Your colony isn't failing, because Stack 3 is drifting." Carol tilted her head slightly. "Then why is it failing?" George zoomed the map outward. The entire valley appeared as a network of power flows. Energy radiated from the 4 fusion stacks outward through the colony like blood through arteries. George highlighted several districts. "These expansion zones," he said. Carol crossed her arms. "Yes. They're drawing power allocations that exceed the margin your grid was designed for. They were approved by the Civic Board. I don't doubt it. Brenda leaned forward. Wait, she said. You're saying the reactor drift is caused by grid instability? George nodded. You've been compensating for fluctuating load demand. That's normal. Yes, George said. But not when the fluctuations exceed injector response tolerance. Carol studied the display. So the reactor isn't failing? No. It's being pushed. Exactly. Brenda frowned. But load fluctuations are gradual. The reactor should compensate. George expanded another graph. A jagged pattern appeared. This isn't gradual. Carol leaned closer. What is it? George looked at both women. Someone is drawing massive intermittent loads. Brenda blinked. That would show up in grid reports. Not if they're classified. Carol's expression hardened. Research district. George nodded. The new research complex in the far valley had been drawing enormous power bursts. Short bursts. Unpredictable bursts. Enough to distort plasma flow inside Stack 3. Brenda exhaled slowly. That explains the injector pattern. Carol remained very still. Which research group? She asked. George zoomed in on the grid again. One facility pulsed bright red. Deep substrate exploration. Brenda muttered. They're drilling. George shook his head. Not drilling. Carol's eyes narrowed. What then? George studied the energy curve again. Scanning. Scanning what? He pointed toward the far mountains visible through the control room window. The planet. They left the reactor building shortly after midnight. From the power district ridge, the valley glowed even brighter now. Construction lights burned in the new districts. Transport rails moved cargo across the basin like lines of molten gold. Brenda crossed her arms. So, our reactor is being bullied by scientists. George nodded. That's one way to describe it. Carol looked out over the valley. If I shut down their project, the Research Council will accuse civic operations of sabotaging discovery. If you don't, George said calmly, your reactor stability will degrade until something breaks. Which would give them a better argument. Exactly. Brenda shook her head. Colony politics, she muttered. George watched the distant research towers glowing in the far valley. Politics is just engineering applied to people. Carol looked at him thoughtfully. You've been here less than a day. Machines and societies fail in the same ways, he said. And how is that? They ignore their load limits. Carol smiled faintly. Mr. Michelson, I think you may become very useful here. Brenda glanced between them. Let me guess, she said. Tomorrow we go talk to the scientists. George nodded. Carol turned toward the crawler. Yes, she said. And we're going to find out exactly what kind of experiment requires enough power to destabilize a fusion reactor. Far across the valley, the research district flashed with another brief surge of energy. For a moment, the sky glowed green. George watched the pulse carefully. Then he said quietly, That's not a normal planetary scan. Brenda looked at him. What do you mean? George didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the distant facility where the next burst of energy was already beginning to rise. Finally, he said, It means something under this planet is worth an enormous amount of electricity. And somewhere deep beneath the mountains of Hesper Vale, the colony had started looking for it. The research district lay beyond the eastern ridge, where the basin narrowed into a long canyon of polished stone and wind-cut mesas. From orbit, it looked like a cluster of bright nodes along the valley floor. From the ground, it felt more temporary. Metal structures anchored into bedrock, sensor towers rising from the slopes, antenna fields angled toward the sky like silent questions. George Michelson watched the landscape slide past through the crawler's forward window. A transport shuttle had just passed overhead, descending from orbital platform Helios. Its engines burned violet against the sky as it angled toward the landing field near the research complex. The large primary world, Thalassa's red super-terrestrial companion, hung impossibly large above the horizon, a swollen sphere of iron-colored clouds and faint lightning storms. Even after 2 days on the planet, the sight still felt slightly unreal. "Traffic's picking up," Brenda Clark said from the driver's seat. "That shuttle bringing equipment?" George asked. "Probably," she said. "Research Council's been pulling in cargo priority since the scans started getting interesting." George looked toward the distant towers of the research facility. "How many people work out here?" "About 600, Brenda said. "Mostly geophysics, materials science, and planetary structure. 600 scientists pulling intermittent power spikes big enough to destabilize a fusion reactor." She shrugged. "They say discovery takes energy." The crawler crested a ridge, and the facility came fully into view. Unlike the main colony, the research district had been built outward rather than upward. Low structures spread across the canyon floor in wide arcs, connected by illuminated transport tracks. At the center rose the scanning array. 3 tall towers surrounding a circular platform embedded directly into the rock. From a distance, the array resembled a gigantic instrument, which, George realized, was exactly what it was. Carol Rourke stood waiting outside the main administration dome when they arrived. She had traveled separately by shuttle that morning, and now leaned against the railing overlooking the canyon floor. "Good timing," she said as they approached. George followed her gaze. The scanning array was powering up. Blue light flickered along the circular platform as capacitors charged. Above it, the 3 towers hummed with barely audible vibration. "What exactly am I looking at?" George asked. Carol answered calmly. "A deep planetary tomography array." George blinked. "That's a serious piece of equipment." "It should be," she said. "It took 6 years to build." Brenda crossed her arms. "And apparently enough electricity to upset our entire power grid." Carol gestured toward the facility entrance. "Let's hear the explanation from the people responsible." The lead researcher met them in the Central Operations Hall. Dr. Elena Varga was a tall woman, with silver hair tied back in a tight knot, and the distracted intensity common to people who spent more time thinking about planets than people. She greeted Carol with professional caution. "Director Rourke." "Doctor." Carol gestured to George and Brenda. "Dr. Varga, this is George Michelson, systems engineer, and Brenda Clark from Colonial Works." Varga nodded politely. "Ah, the power issue." Brenda smiled thinly. "You could call it that." Varga led them into the control chamber overlooking the scanning platform. From here, the entire canyon array was visible through reinforced glass. George immediately noticed the equipment. "Mass drivers," he said. Gravitational pulse emitters, Varga corrected gently. Same principle. She smiled faintly. Close enough. George studied the instrumentation displays along the wall. Let me guess, he said. You're sending energy pulses into the crust and measuring the resonance patterns. Exactly, Varga said. Carol leaned against the console. And those pulses require enormous power. Yes. How enormous? Varga pointed to the energy graph. George whistled softly. Each scan required roughly the same energy output as a small fusion plant for several seconds. That explains the reactor instability, he said. Varga nodded. We suspected that. Brenda turned sharply. You suspected? We didn't expect the grid coupling to be so sensitive. George shook his head. Your pulses are distorting load symmetry across the valley grid. Stack 3 compensates, injector flow shifts, and the plasma field drifts. Varga sighed. I see. Carol's voice remained calm but firm. Doctor, the question is why this scanning program requires that much power. Varga turned toward the display. A geological map of the valley appeared, layer after layer of planetary crust. But at a depth nearly 12 kilometers beneath the basin, there was something unusual. George leaned closer. What is that? The shape looked like a long band running beneath the valley floor. Dense, continuous, highly conductive. Varga folded her arms. We believe it's a natural metallic lattice. George frowned. Metallic? Not exactly metal, she said. A crystalline structure formed under immense planetary pressure. Brenda stared at the map. And that requires blowing half the colony's power reserves to scan? Varga nodded slowly. Because we believe it may be one of the most unusual materials ever discovered. George looked at her. How unusual? Varga enlarged the data set. Electrical conductivity readings appeared on the screen. George stared. Then he said quietly, That can't be right. Varga smiled faintly. We ran the numbers 6 times. Carol stepped closer. Explain. Varga tapped the display. This formation conducts electricity with almost zero resistance. Brenda blinked. You're saying it's a superconductor? Yes. George shook his head. At what temperature? Varga hesitated slightly. Approximately 280 Kelvin. Silence filled the room. George turned slowly. That's nearly room temperature. Correct. Brenda whispered. That's impossible. Varga shook her head. Apparently not. George stared at the geological model. The structure stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the basin, a continuous mineral lattice embedded within the crust. If this is real, he said slowly, you're sitting on the largest superconductive structure ever discovered. Exactly, Varga said. Carol's expression remained composed, but George could see calculation behind her eyes. What would it mean? She asked. George answered immediately. Perfect power transmission. He pointed to the map. You could run fusion plants on one side of the valley and deliver energy anywhere with zero loss. Brenda leaned closer. Cities could be built thousands of kilometers away. Orbital launch systems, George added. Mass drivers powered directly from ground reactors. Carol spoke quietly. The colony becomes the energy hub of the entire system. Varga nodded. And that's just the beginning. George turned to her. You think the structure is larger than the valley. We think it may extend beneath most of the planet's crust. Brenda exhaled slowly. A planetary-scale superconductor. George said nothing. Instead, he studied the depth readings. 12 kilometers. Embedded in stable rock. Perfect electrical properties. Carol folded her arms. And you need these scans to map the entire structure. Yes, Varga said, but the scans destabilize the power grid. Yes. Carol looked at George. How long before the reactor drift becomes dangerous? George thought carefully. If the scans continue at this rate? Yes. 2 weeks, he said. Brenda nodded. That sounds right. Carol looked back toward the scanning array outside the window. The towers glowed brighter as another pulse prepared to fire. Doctor, she said quietly, you may have discovered the most valuable geological structure in human history. Varga did not deny it. But if we shut down the scans, she said, we lose the chance to fully understand it. George watched the energy graph climb again. Another pulse was coming. Another strain on the colony grid. He turned to Carol. You're about to have a political problem. She nodded. I know. Outside the window, the array discharged another gravitational pulse. The canyon flashed blue, and 12 kilometers beneath the surface of Hesper Vale. The buried crystal lattice carried the energy wave across the planet like a bell ringing in stone. The rover moved slowly across the basin floor, its suspension arms flexing over fractured rock that had not been disturbed by wind or water for millions of years. Dust rose behind it in a thin, rust-colored plume that lingered in the weak atmosphere before settling again into silence. Inside the rover cab, George Michelson studied the terrain display projected across the dashboard. The map showed the superconductive formation as a glowing band beneath the valley floor, 12 kilometers below the rover's current position, extending far beyond the limits of the original survey. Brenda Clark drove with the steady patience of someone who had spent years navigating this planet's unpredictable ground. The valley ahead stretched for dozens of kilometers between steep mineral ridges that glowed faintly under the light of the system's star and the enormous red world hanging low on the horizon. Carol Rourke sat behind them, reviewing the newest energy reports from the colony grid. The rover climbed a small rise and stopped. Outside, the basin opened into a wide geological corridor. 3 suited researchers stood on a ridge nearby, scanning the terrain with portable instruments. Their utility vehicle sat beside them like a patient insect, its cargo module full of sensor equipment. George opened the rover door and stepped down onto the rock. Even through the suit boots, he could feel the faint vibration of the ground beneath him. Not seismic, something more subtle. "Tell me you feel that," Brenda said as she stepped out beside him. George nodded. Resonance. Carol joined them, her helmet visor reflecting the enormous sky. The red superterrestrial primary hung above the horizon like a massive painted sphere, streaked with iron-colored storms and faint lightning arcs within its clouds. Beyond it, 2 smaller moons drifted slowly across the sky. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then George looked down at the geological scanner mounted on his wrist. The instrument confirmed what his instincts had already guessed. This entire valley is sitting directly above the formation. Brenda frowned. "I thought the lattice was deeper." "It is," George said. "But the crust above it is thinner here." Carol looked across the canyon walls. "Which means this was probably the first place it reached near the surface." "Exactly." Dr. Elena Varga's geological models had suggested that the superconductive formation formed deep inside the planet's mantle billions of years earlier. Extreme pressure, extreme temperature, rare chemical conditions. Under those conditions, certain metallic elements had crystallized into a lattice structure unlike anything normally produced in planetary crust. Over geological time, the planet's tectonic forces had lifted portions of the lattice closer to the surface. Most of it remained buried deep underground. But here, in this basin, it had risen within reachable distance of human technology. George crouched and placed a portable field probe against the rock surface. The instrument sent a narrow energy pulse downward. A moment later, the return signal came back. George stared at the readings. "Good Lord." Brenda looked over his shoulder. "What?" "The conductivity." "What about it?" "It's higher here." Carol stepped closer. "Higher than what?" George stood slowly. "Higher than the readings from the research scans." Brenda blinked. "You mean the lattice is stronger here?" George nodded. "Much stronger." He looked across the valley floor. This entire basin might be the shallowest section of the structure on the planet. Carol exhaled slowly. "That makes Hesper Vale the most valuable colony in human space." George didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the distant horizon where the research towers were barely visible against the red sky. "Or the most dangerous." Back at the colony, the fusion reactors were struggling. George had left Stack 3 operating with temporary compensation adjustments, but the grid fluctuations from the scanning array were growing worse. Every time the research facility fired a deep tomography pulse, the valley grid surged. Stack 3 responded automatically by adjusting injector symmetry. The compensation worked, but each correction pushed the system slightly further from its ideal stability. Like a machine trying to balance while someone kept nudging the floor beneath it. Inside the rover, Carol reviewed the latest reactor telemetry. "Stack 3 drift increased another 0.3%, she said. Brenda cursed under her breath. 2 weeks just became 10 days. George nodded. "Probably." Carol looked at him. "Can you stabilize it?" "Temporarily." "And permanently?" "Only if the scanning pulses stop." Carol said nothing. The rover climbed another ridge. Below them, the valley floor glowed faintly with mineral reflections. George noticed something unusual. Bands of metallic crystal shimmered within the canyon walls. Not exposed fully. Just thin veins. Like the edge of something enormous buried below. Brenda saw them too. Those weren't in the geological surveys. "No," George said quietly. "They weren't." Carol leaned forward in her seat. "What does that mean?" George watched the glittering lines running through the rock. "It means the formation is closer to the surface than anyone realized." Brenda frowned. "That's good news, right?" George shook his head slowly. "Not necessarily." "Why not?" "Because if the lattice connects to the surface anywhere—" He paused. Carol finished the thought. "The planet itself might be part of the electrical circuit." George nodded. Back at the research station, the tomography array fired another pulse. The energy wave traveled downward through the crust. It struck the superconductive lattice 12 kilometers below the valley, and the entire formation carried the energy through the planet with almost perfect efficiency. Across thousands of kilometers of buried crystal, like sound moving through a bell, George watched the sensor readings climb on his wrist monitor. The wave had already traveled beyond the valley, beyond the mountain range, possibly halfway around the planet. Brenda stared at the data. That signal just crossed 600 kilometers. Carol spoke quietly. How big is this structure? George answered with unsettling calm. Possibly planetary. Brenda leaned back in her seat. You're telling me we're sitting on top of a global superconductive network? Looks that way. Carol's voice remained steady. If that's true, this colony just became strategically important. George looked out the rover window toward the enormous sky. Strategic is one word for it. And the other? Contested. Carol nodded. Yes. They drove in silence for several minutes. Then Brenda broke it. You know Earth's going to want control of this. George said nothing. Carol finally spoke. They already do. Brenda glanced back at her. What do you mean? Carol tapped the comm display. An orbital courier just arrived from the Helios platform. George looked over. With what message? Carol's voice was calm. A priority transmission from the Interstellar Resource Authority. Brenda groaned. Of course. George didn't smile. What do they want? Carol looked out across the valley where the buried superconductive lattice quietly carried the energy of the latest scan through the crust of the planet. What they always want, she said. Jurisdiction. George checked the sensor display again. Then he frowned. That's odd. Brenda glanced over. What now? The resonance signal. What about it? George adjusted the scanner. The reflected energy wave from the lattice should have dissipated by now. But instead, part of it was returning, slowly, from deep within the planet. Carol leaned forward. That shouldn't happen. George nodded. No, it shouldn't. The signal continued climbing, a faint echo traveling back through the superconductive network. Brenda stared at the screen. Where is it coming from? George studied the depth readings. Then he looked up at the distant mountains. About 400 kilometers away. Carol folded her arms. What's there? George answered quietly. The other end of the formation. Brenda frowned. And? George watched the signal continue to rise. It's reflecting. Carol tilted her head. Off what? George didn't answer immediately, because the reflection pattern looked almost structured, regular, deliberate. He finally spoke. Something very dense. Brenda laughed softly. Dense like what? George stared at the display. Dense like an entire mountain made of the same crystal. Carol's voice dropped. You're saying the superconductive lattice isn't just a formation? George nodded slowly. It might be a planetary-scale structure. Brenda raised an eyebrow. You mean like a natural geological layer? George shook his head. No. He pointed to the returning resonance signal. A network. And somewhere far beneath the crust of Hesper, the energy wave continued traveling through the buried crystal structure, across thousands of kilometers of ancient planetary pressure, toward something at the far end of the lattice that had just answered back. Morning on Hesper Vale began slowly. The sun rose through layers of mineral haze along the eastern mountains, turning the sky into a gradual wash of crimson, gold, and green. Above the horizon, the massive red superterrestrial, Thalassa Major, still hung low, its swirling storms reflecting sunlight across the valley like moving embers. From the observation platform of the research tower, George Michelson watched the colony come awake. Transport rails hummed to life across the basin. Dome lights dimmed as interior systems shifted from night cycle to day operations. Cargo shuttles moved between the orbital platform and the landing fields outside the main habitation zone. But George wasn't looking at the colony. He was looking toward the western mountains. Somewhere beyond them, 400 kilometers across the basin, the resonant signal from the superconductive lattice had reflected back. A signal that should not exist. Behind him, the door slid open. Brenda Clark stepped onto the platform carrying 2 metal cups of something that smelled faintly like coffee. "Sleep?" she asked. "Not really." "Good," she said, handing him one, "because things just got worse." George raised an eyebrow. "That's impressive." Brenda tapped the screen on the wall behind them. The valley grid appeared. Energy demand had spiked again overnight. The scanning array had run 3 additional tomography pulses while most of the colony slept. George exhaled. "Stack 3? "Still stable," Brenda said, "but barely." George studied the graph. The compensation curves were beginning to overlap. "That reactor is working harder to maintain symmetry every time the array fires." Brenda nodded. "Carol's already in meetings with the civic board." "About shutting down the scans?" "About who gets blamed when she does." George almost smiled. "Politics." Brenda leaned against the railing beside him. "Apparently the Research Council thinks we're exaggerating the reactor instability." "They always do." "You've worked with scientists before." George took a slow drink of the bitter coffee. "Scientists assume reality will cooperate eventually." "And engineers?" "Assume it won't." Brenda laughed quietly. Inside the research command hall, Carol Rourke stood before a wall-sized projection of the planet. Dr. Elena Varga had mapped the superconductive lattice across nearly half the hemisphere. The formation was far larger than anyone had expected. It ran beneath mountain ranges, across ancient impact basins, through the deep crust beneath the oceans. A planetary-scale mineral network. But one region stood out: the Western Highlands. A dense cluster of reflections had returned from that area after the last tomography pulse. Carol gestured toward it. "This is where the signal echoed." Varga nodded. "Yes." "Explain." Varga enlarged the model. The lattice network converged at a point beneath a massive mountain plateau. "This section appears denser than the rest of the formation." George stepped closer. "How much denser?" "Nearly double." Brenda whistled. "That's a lot of crystal." Varga shook her head. "It may not just be crystal." George looked at her. "What do you mean?" She pulled up the resonance waveform. The returning signal showed repeating interference patterns. Regular intervals, structured reflections. George studied it carefully. "That's not random geology." "No," Varga said. "It isn't." Carol crossed her arms. "So what are we looking at?" George thought for several seconds. Then he spoke slowly. "Imagine the lattice like a planetary electrical grid." Varga nodded. "Go on." If energy travels through it efficiently enough, the entire structure behaves like a conductor. Brenda followed the logic immediately. And the dense region acts like a junction. Exactly. Carol looked back at the map. So the signal reflected because it hit something larger. George nodded. Something massive. Brenda frowned. You're saying there's a central node in this network? George nodded again. Yes. Carol studied the projection. And you want to go see it? George didn't hesitate. Yes. 3 hours later, the expedition convoy lifted from the valley floor. 2 survey rovers, 1 cargo crawler, and a small atmospheric shuttle flying escort overhead. The route to the Western Highlands crossed almost half the basin. From the air, the colony looked smaller than George expected. Just a cluster of lights and domes surrounded by enormous wilderness. The real scale of the planet revealed itself beyond the valley. Endless mountain chains, crimson deserts, ice fields stretching toward the polar horizon. This was not a colony world. It was a frontier barely touched by human presence. Brenda sat beside George in the rover cockpit as the convoy crossed the eastern ridge. You ever realize, she said quietly, how small the colony actually is? George nodded. Every day. 16,000 people. On a planet bigger than Mars. Brenda glanced out the window. And sitting on the most valuable mineral discovery in history. George corrected her. Possibly. She laughed. You engineers always hedge. Because nature usually disappoints. Back in Hesper Vale, Carol Rourke faced the civic board. The chamber overlooked the central valley through a long, transparent wall. The city towers glowed beneath the rising sun. Council members argued around the table. The scans must continue, one said. The discovery is too important. Another shook his head. If the reactor destabilizes, the entire colony is at risk. A third voice joined. Earth authorities will want direct oversight. Carol finally raised a hand. The room fell silent. We have 2 realities, she said calmly. First, the superconductive formation beneath this planet may change the balance of energy infrastructure across human space. She paused. Second, if we destabilize the fusion grid, the colony dies. No one argued with that. Carol turned to the display behind her. George's expedition route appeared. They are heading toward the resonance source now. And if it confirms the network structure? Carol answered quietly. Then Hesper Vale becomes the most strategically important world humanity has ever settled. By late afternoon, the convoy reached the Western Highlands. The terrain here was harsher than the basin. Jagged ridges cut through red mineral plains. The atmosphere thinned noticeably as the convoy climbed toward the plateau. George watched the scanner readings rise steadily. Signal strength is increasing. Brenda slowed the rover. Meaning? We're getting closer. Ahead, the mountain plateau opened into a wide circular valley. The rock walls surrounding it glowed faintly in the fading sunlight. George stepped out of the rover. Even before activating the scanner, he could feel the difference. The ground here vibrated faintly, like the distant hum of an enormous machine. Brenda looked around. This place gives me the creeps. George activated the scanner. The display immediately saturated with data. He stared. Then he whispered, "Holy." Carol stepped out of the second rover. What? George pointed at the ground. The lattice. Brenda leaned over his shoulder. What about it? It's everywhere. The scanner showed dense crystal veins running through the rock beneath their feet. But not just veins. A massive structure lay buried beneath the plateau, miles across, possibly tens of miles. Carol looked at George. The node. George nodded slowly. Yes. Brenda looked around the valley. You're telling me the heart of the network is under this mountain? George studied the readings again. Then he frowned. What? Brenda asked. George adjusted the sensor range. The resonance signal was still returning. But now, something else appeared. A faint oscillation inside the lattice. A repeating energy pattern. Carol noticed his expression. What is it? George stared at the screen. The lattice isn't just conducting energy. Brenda leaned closer. What do you mean? George pointed at the waveform. It's storing it. Carol frowned. That's not possible. George shook his head. No. He looked across the plateau toward the distant mountains. It's acting like a planetary capacitor. Brenda blinked. A what? A massive electrical storage system. Carol's voice dropped. You're saying this planet can store enormous amounts of energy? George nodded slowly. Possibly more than any power grid humanity has ever built? Brenda looked around the silent plateau. So, the lattice isn't just useful. George finished the thought. It's infrastructure. Carol exhaled. A natural power network built into the planet. George nodded, but he still watched the oscillating signal, because something about it still bothered him. Brenda noticed. What now? George adjusted the scanner again. The oscillation repeated. Perfectly timed. Regular. Precise. Carol saw it too. That's not natural. George nodded. No. Brenda crossed her arms. So, what is it? George looked across the plateau. Then he said quietly, It looks like someone, or something, has already been using the network. Silence fell across the expedition team. Above them, the massive red planet filled half the sky. And beneath their feet, the superconductive lattice continued carrying energy through the crust of Hesper, across an entire world, like a power grid waiting to be switched on. The first orbital ships arrived 3 days later. They appeared in the evening sky above Hesper Vale like faint silver scratches against the darkness, descending slowly from the Helios platform. Their engines burned pale blue through the thin atmosphere as they settled into holding positions above the basin. From the central tower observation deck, Carol Rourke watched them arrive. She had expected it. Once the Discovery report reached the Interstellar Resource Authority, response had been inevitable. Earth governments did not ignore planetary-scale infrastructure. Behind her, the Civic Board argued quietly around the long conference table. Their voices echoed faintly through the chamber as the city lights of Hesper Vale spread across the valley below. 16,000 people, a handful of domes, 4 fusion reactors. And beneath it all, the largest natural superconductive structure ever discovered. Carol turned away from the window. They're early, one council member said nervously. They're efficient, Carol corrected. Another council member spoke. What authority do they claim? Jurisdiction over strategic planetary resources. That's not in the original colonial charter. No, Carol said calmly. It isn't. Across the valley, George Michelson stood inside the control ring of Stack 3. The reactor chamber glowed faintly behind layers of armored shielding. Magnetic containment fields hummed with a low mechanical resonance that George could feel through the soles of his boots. Brenda Clark leaned against the control console beside him. How bad? George studied the diagnostics. Injector asymmetry is now compensating every 20 seconds. That's worse. Yes. Brenda rubbed her temples. How long? George didn't hesitate. 48 hours. Before what? Before the reactor trips itself offline. Brenda exhaled slowly. If that happens, the entire valley grid collapses, and the colony goes dark. George nodded. Outside the observation window, the city towers glowed beneath the rising stars. Brenda crossed her arms. And the scans? George turned toward the geological model floating above the console. The superconductive lattice spread beneath the planet like a glowing network of buried rivers. Still firing every 6 hours. Because the Research Council refuses to stop. George nodded. They want a full planetary map before Earth takes control. Brenda laughed quietly. So, everyone's racing the clock. Yes. Carol arrived at the reactor complex shortly after midnight. George and Brenda met her in the control room. The three of them stood around the holographic projection of the planetary lattice. Carol spoke first. The Resource Authority delegation lands tomorrow. George nodded. I assumed. They intend to assume operational control of the Discovery. Brenda muttered something unprintable. Carol ignored it. They're also bringing engineers. George folded his arms. To take over the research network. Yes. Brenda looked between them. So we either shut down the scans, or they do, George finished. Carol studied the lattice projection. What happens if we don't? George expanded the energy model. The planetary network lit up. If the lattice truly acts like a superconductive capacitor, then it can store enormous amounts of energy. Brenda frowned. Define enormous. George highlighted the planetary core. More than the colony grid produces in a year. Carol looked at him. And if we synchronize the fusion reactors with the lattice... The projection changed. Energy flowed from the valley reactors directly into the buried crystal network. Brenda's eyes widened. You could charge the planet. George nodded. More accurately, charge the network. Carol understood immediately. And once it's charged... George looked toward the western mountains. We control the switch. At dawn, the convoy returned to the plateau, where the superconductive node lay closest to the surface. The valley stretched below them, glowing in the early light. Far away, the colony towers shone beneath the rising sun. George placed the field interface unit against the rock. The superconductive lattice responded immediately. Energy readings surged across his display. Brenda stood beside him. You're sure about this? No, George said honestly. But the physics works. Carol stood behind them, watching the horizon. If we activate the network before the Resource Authority arrives... Brenda finished the thought. They can't take control. George nodded. The infrastructure will already belong to the colony. Carol looked down at the valley. 16,000 people lived there. Families, children, workers, scientists, engineers. A fragile civilization held together by power, water, air, and cooperation. And now, possibly the most important energy network humanity had ever discovered. She made her decision. Do it. Back at Hesper Vale, the fusion reactors ramped up simultaneously. Stack 1, Stack 2, Stack 3, Stack 4. For the first time since the colony's founding, every reactor fed power into a single system. George's interface unit connected the valley grid to the buried superconductive lattice. Energy surged downward through the crust, across kilometers of crystal, into the planetary network. Brenda watched the energy graph climb, capacitance increasing. George nodded. Lattice conductivity holding. Carol stood quietly beside them. The planet beneath their feet hummed faintly. The lattice accepted the energy without resistance, without loss, without limit. The grid expanded outward through the crust, across mountains, beneath oceans, through the deep stone mantle. A planetary power network awakening after billions of years of geological formation. George watched the charge curve stabilize. Then he looked up. It's ready. The Resource Authority ships descended into the valley just as the sun reached the horizon. Their landing thrusters illuminated the colony with bright white light. Officials emerged from the first transport vessel, surrounded by engineers and security personnel. Carol met them on the landing platform. "Director Rourke," the delegation leader said, "we are here to assume operational authority over the superconductive formation beneath this planet." Carol nodded politely.
I expected you.
"You understand the importance of this discovery?" "Yes." "Then you understand why it must be managed by the authority." Carol smiled faintly. "That will not be necessary." The official frowned. "I'm afraid you misunderstand." "No," Carol said calmly. "I understand perfectly." She tapped her wrist console. Across the valley, the lights of Hesper Vale brightened. Power surged through every line of the colony grid. The buried lattice beneath the planet carried the energy effortlessly. George's voice came over the comm. "Network online." Brenda added, "Planetary transmission stable." Carol looked back at the delegation. "You arrived just after activation." The officials stared at the valley. "What activation?" Carol gestured toward the horizon. "The colony has already integrated the superconductive network into our infrastructure." "That's impossible." George's voice answered over the public channel. "No, it's engineering." That night, the lights of Hesper Vale shone brighter than they ever had before. Energy flowed freely through the superconductive network beneath the planet. The colony grid stabilized. The fusion reactors operated at lower load while delivering greater power. Across the valley, new transmission towers rose. Orbital launch platforms began construction. Mass drivers were planned along the mountain ridges. For the first time since humanity left Earth, a colony possessed a planetary-scale power network. George stood on the observation ridge with Brenda and Carol as the city glowed beneath them. Brenda broke the silence. "So what happens now?" George looked across the valley. "Now, the colony grows." Carol watched the stars appear one by one above the enormous red planet hanging in the sky. "The authority will argue," she said. "Earth governments will protest. And Carol smiled slightly. They will adapt. George nodded. Because infrastructure changed politics. It always had. Brenda looked across the glowing valley. 16,000 people sitting on the most powerful energy system in human space. George corrected her. 16,000 people who built it. Carol watched the distant launch towers beginning construction along the ridge. This planet was always going to matter, she said. George looked down at the valley grid glowing beneath them. Yes. He paused. But now it belongs to the people who live here. Far beneath their feet, the superconductive lattice continued carrying energy across the crust of Hesper. A natural network forged by geological pressure over billions of years, now connected to human civilization. And somewhere deep inside the planet, the crystal lattice held the charge of an entire colony, waiting, ready, for whatever humanity chose to build next.